Jean-Antoine Metzinger was a major 20th-century French painter, theorist, writer, critic and poet, who along with artist Albert Gleizes, wrote the first theoretical work on Cubism. His standing as one of the leading lights of the Cubist movement rests both on the excellence of his paintings and on his theoretical writings. His earliest works were strongly influenced by Neo-Impressionism, Divisionism, and Fauvism, as well as the paintings of artist Paul Cézanne. As a member of the so-called Salon Cubists, he was instrumental in bringing Cubism to the attention of the general public. Jean Metzinger was born in Nantes, France, on June 24, 1883. He had a younger brother Maurice, who became a musician. After his father died early, the boy was raised by his mother, Eugénie Argaud, a music professor. She wanted her son to become a doctor, and encouraged him to develop interests in mathematics, music, and painting. In 1898, 15-year-old Metzinger began studying painting in Nantes at the Académie Cours Cambronne. His teacher was a well-known painter who taught a strictly academic and conventional style. The lessons focused on traditional techniques, precise anatomy, and realistic representation. Exhibiting regularly, he participated in the first of the Autumn Salon exhibitions in Paris in 1903. He had some success, and his sales at the time were enough to support himself as a professional painter. During this period, Neo-Impressionism began to enjoy a surge in popularity, following a large Paul Signac exhibition in Paris in December 1904. This event was followed by a major Georges Seurat retrospective at the Salon of the Independents in 1905, as well as a successful solo exhibition by Henri Edmond Cross in the same year. Excited by these trends, Metzinger began painting in a similar style, separating his colors into individual dots, making his pictures appear more luminous and vibrant. He exhibited these works in Paris, and took part in a group show with other artists in November 1903. His more daring use of color at the exhibition soon caught the attention of gallery owner and art dealer Berthe Vail. She became a critical early supporter, exhibiting Metzinger's work at her gallery from 1903 to 1922. Berthe Vail was the first Parisian art dealer to sell Pablo Picasso's works. Along with Picasso and Metzinger, Vail also promoted Henri Matisse, André Derain, Amedeo Modigliani, and Maurice Utrillo. By 1905, Metzinger, who was attracted to the works of Henri Matisse and André Derain, began to use freer brushstrokes, more simplified forms, with vivid colors. This painting uses combined styles. It is painted in bright colors, similar to Matisse, but it is divisionist in its composition. The foreground and background are flattened, and there is minimal perspective. It no longer represents nature as seen, but is a byproduct of the artist's sensations. He showed 8 paintings at the Salon of the Independents in the spring of 1905, exhibiting alongside Henri Matisse and André Derain, confirming his move towards what was soon to become known as Fauvism. In 1906, Metzinger formed a close friendship with artist Robert Delaunay, and the two painted each other's portraits using prominent rectangles of color. In these portraits the brush strokes are large and block-like, which was unlike anything being produced by other artists at the time. Metzinger explained his method. "I don't use separated brushstrokes simply to reproduce how light falls on objects," he said. "I use them to create shimmering color effects and new visual sensations." Metzinger's painting, Danse Piquante, illustrates his technique. Here he uses blocks of similar-sized contrasting colors to create a mosaic-like scene. The bold use of color and geometric form in Piquante is very noticeable. The brushstrokes are all similar in size, giving rhythm to the overall work. The perspective is flattened, and the subject matter is classical, yet its treatment is not. Here Metzinger has managed to infuse new life into the theme. He referred to the effect as chromatic poetry. Metzinger's work began to be recognized in the Paris art world by critics, private collectors and art dealers for their originality. His combinations of vibrant colors and geometric form were unlike any work produced by other artists at the time. Such was his reputation, that he was asked to serve on the hanging committee of the Salon of the Independents in 1906. A great honor. It was within this interconnected network of Parisian artists and models that Metzinger met his future wife, Lucie Soubiron. Lucie became his frequent model and companion, and he painted her often. She is shown here in a fashionable Parisienne style, with an elegant hat. In December 1909, Metzinger married her. Nothing much is known about Lucie, although several of Metzinger's later paintings depict her. Metzinger and Delaunay exhibited together again at the Bert Vale Gallery in 1907. An art critic commenting on the show described them both as artists who used mosaic-like structures to construct small, but highly symbolic compositions. In 1908, Metzinger sent 5 paintings to the Golden Fleece Salon in Moscow to exhibit with the Fauvists. Other artists taking part were Georges Braque, André Derain, Kees van Dongen, and Henri Matisse. Metzinger's works appearing at the show helped to launch his international reputation. Around 1907, Metzinger was introduced to the highly influential literary and artistic circle of the poet Guillaume Apollinaire. They instantly shared a strong intellectual rapport. Apollinaire's group frequently gathered in the Montmartre district of Paris, and counted artists Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque among their members. That year, Metzinger exhibited again at Bert Vale's gallery, with artists André Derain, Fernand Léger, Pablo Picasso, and Robert Delaunay. He showed this painting, in which he has abandoned his neo-impressionist style. The expressionist work is rendered in a Fauvist palette, and the landscape is broken into mosaic-like brushstrokes and flat fragments. The terrain and vegetation are treated as structured geometric units, rather than as continuous natural forms. A number of Metzinger landscapes from around this time simplify houses, trees, and hills into angular blocks. These works show Cézanne's influence transformed into sharper, flat segments. He began abandoning highlights, shading and other color effects used by painters to trick the eye and make a flat canvas look three-dimensional. Now, classical perspective became insufficient for him to represent what he believed was the true nature of reality. That is a world that is dynamic, and changing in time. He began rendering figures and landscapes in angular planes and interlocking geometric surfaces, emphasizing form, rather than realistic depiction. This was the beginning of Metzinger's move away from Fauvism and divisionism to what is now recognized as his pre-Cubist period. In this painting, the figures and landscape dissolve into interconnected arcs and geometric planes. Instead of modeling bodies naturally, Metzinger has constructed them from faceted surfaces that flatten space and merge the figure with the environment. Earlier, in 1907, artist Pablo Picasso had begun experimenting with a fragmented representation of the human body, inspired by African and Iberian art. His painting, The Young Ladies of Avignon, is now considered a major turning point in artistic evolution. Picasso's paintings shattered several long-held artistic conventions. In this work, perspective is fractured and inconsistent, the figures are angular, mask-like, and aggressive, and space collapses towards the picture plane. The Young Ladies of Avignon was a violent break from existing styles. Today art historians often classify it as pre-Cubist, thinking of it as a transitional work on the path to Cubism. Georges Braque, who first met Pablo Picasso in Paris in 1907, saw the painting in Picasso's studio and initially reacted with shock. After thinking about it, he began to see the possibilities that Picasso's new direction might offer. Braque began to simplify his own landscapes, applying Paul Cézanne's method of rendering solid masses through interlocking facets, rather than using linear perspective. He exhibited the landscapes he had painted of Lestarc in a solo exhibition in Paris in November 1908. Reviewing the exhibition, an art critic claimed that Braque had reduced everything to geometry and cubes. From then on, the term cubism began to be used to describe similar paintings. At first the term was meant as an insult, but it was eventually accepted and continues to be used today. Later, when Braque submitted his landscapes to the Paris 1908 Autumn Salon, they were rejected by the selection committee as being unsuitable. When Picasso saw Braque's landscapes, he was inspired. In the summer of 1909, on his travels to Spain, he painted Houses on the Hill, a work which borrowed Braque's geometric simplification and pushed them further. After that, Picasso's techniques matured further. In his Seated Woman, objects are broken down into angular facets and simplified geometries, suggesting multiple viewpoints. These cohesive rhythmic patterns bridged his earlier African-influenced distortions with emerging analytic fragmentation. By late 1909, Picasso and Braque were working so closely that they described themselves as two mountain climbers tied together. They shared a mutual goal: to reject traditional single-point perspective in favor of showing objects as though from multiple directions and merging them on the canvas. Picasso's Woman with a Mandolin is a transitional work showing the changes. The painting, produced amid frequent studio exchanges between the two artists, marks the gradual progression from the clarity of their 1909 landscapes to their more complex later works. By 1910, the pair had begun pushing their explorations toward the fragmented characteristics of what is now called analytic cubism. In these works, the artists increasingly dissolved objects into interlocking geometric planes. They also rejected color, which they said was a distraction. For them, form and structure came first, everything else was secondary. Color was reduced to browns, grays and ochres. In America, art critic Gelett Burgess published an article commenting on the new French art style, titled The Wild Men of Paris. He portrayed Picasso and Braque as central figures among a group of young eccentric talents, experimenting with geometric fragmentation and primitive influences. This portrayal of the wild men as untamed geniuses, who were fearless, yet potentially mad, foreshadowed a wider debate on whether such distortions were a sign of artistic genius, or of gross artistic degeneration. In 1910, Jean Metzinger met Albert Gleizes. Both artists were experimenting with the new visual language introduced by Picasso and Braque. Their working relationship became one of the most significant intellectual partnerships in the history of Cubism. Although they painted in noticeably different styles, and were not especially close personal friends, Metzinger and Gleizes became known as Cubism's principal theorists and public advocates between 1910 and the outbreak of the First World War. Their collaboration was unusual because each arrived at Cubism from different artistic direction. Metzinger began as a neo-impressionist who was influenced by divisionist color theory and was interested in mathematics and geometry. Gleizes was largely self-taught and came from a more social and literary background. His approach to Cubism centered around composition and structure. Their complementary interests eventually helped the two artists produce a theory of Cubism that was generally appealing, both to artists and to intellectuals. Metzinger and Gleizes, and several other artists, started meeting regularly on Sunday afternoons at Jacques Villon's house in Puteaux, a suburb of Paris, and also at Albert Gleizes' studio in nearby Courbevoie. These informal group discussions were somewhat theoretical, covering topics like the fourth dimension in physics and developments in modern painting. Art historians later referred to these artists as the Puteaux Group because of the location of their meetings, but it was never a name the artists used themselves. The term started appearing in art historical writing from the 1930s to the 1950s, to distinguish the public, salon-exhibiting Cubist circle from Picasso and Braque's gallery-based Cubism, which was circulated in private art markets and dealer networks. Members of the Puteaux Group also met at Henri Le Fauconnier's studio. Here the discussions were more about the artists of the past that influenced them, and what the future of painting might bring. They often debated the increasing use of form in their paintings, rejecting the neo-impressionists' emphasis on color. In March 1910, Metzinger presented his portrait of Guillaume Apollinaire at the Salon of the Independents. In this painting, the poet's face and body are broken into overlapping geometric planes. Metzinger uses faceting, not merely decoratively, but structurally, to imply multiple viewpoints and temporal movement. The portrait was hailed by Apollinaire as the first ever Cubist portrait. It was not, however, positively received by everyone. A critic wrote that Metzinger and his contemporaries were ignorant geometers, and had reduced the human body to pallid cubes. In October 1910, works by Delaunay, Claizes, and Metzinger, painted in the radical new style, were hung in close proximity at the Autumn Salon at the Grand Palais in Paris, focusing attention on what these artists had in common. While the term Cubism was not yet widely used, interest in the painting's style flourished over the next few months, with public exhibitions, many articles, and an increasing interchange of ideas between the artists' studios. After the Autumn Salon, Metzinger published an article in the German magazine Pan called A Note on Painting. This was his first major theoretical essay, and it is generally regarded as the first substantial published statement on Cubist theory. In the article he discussed the links between the works of the painters Picasso, Braque, Delaunay, and Le Fauconnier, describing a fundamental quality that he believed they all had in common. Each, he said, had discarded traditional perspective, merging different views of the subject on their canvas as though they had moved around it, and painted it from different directions, to represent the object in both time and space. He also referred to Picasso's works as an example of what Metzinger called the total image, that is, the uniting of both visual experience and understanding. All the artists in Metzinger's group shared the view that art should emphasize both form and sensation. Metzinger applied the ideas he had discussed in his writings in this picture of his wife Lucy. It exhibits all the typical elements of European portraiture, yet it is otherwise thoroughly modern. The color palette, though strikingly naturalistic, features gradients of green, brown and flesh tones. Those subtle hints of light and shadow create the illusion of a moving three-dimensional shape compressed upon the two-dimensional canvas. Metzinger believed color was structurally meaningful and not just decorative. His use of color in his paintings made his form of Cubism more understandable to a skeptical general public. In 1905, the French mathematician Maurice Prince, who became known as the mathematician of Cubism, began giving informal lectures on the latest developments in mathematics to the Montmartre artists, all of whom were passionate about mathematical order. At one of his sessions, he introduced work by mathematician Henri Poincaré in which he had described hypercubes and complex polygons in 4 dimensions, projected onto a 2-dimensional surface. Later, Metzinger referred to Prince as the man who deduced a whole mathematical geometry from the works of Pablo Picasso. Around 1910, many avant-garde artists and writers were fascinated by the idea of a 4th dimension, often called the 4th space. In artistic circles it meant a reality beyond ordinary 3-dimensional perception, and the belief that painting could reveal this deeper structure. For Cubists like Metzinger, traditional Renaissance perspective showing only one fixed instant from one viewpoint was unsatisfactory. He believed reality should be understood through relationships and structure, rather than through appearances alone. By 1911, avant-garde circles in Europe were intensely interested in Cubism and related Paris developments. Metzinger's work had become well known through illustrated magazines, dealer networks, and discussions among artist groups. In April 1911, Metzinger's group participated in the first public exhibition of early Cubist works, at the Salon of the Independents, exhibiting separately in room 41. The Cubist display showed canvases featuring angular faceting, simultaneous viewpoints, and volumetric reduction, all hallmarks of their early geometric experimentation. Metzinger's painting, Two Nudes, was displayed, alongside the work of Gleises, Le Fauconnier, Delaunay, and Léger. The bodies are fragmented into intersecting facets, and viewed from shifting perspectives. Metzinger combines faceting with what he called mobile perspective, where different viewpoints are presented at once. Following the exhibition, an art critic wrote, "This canvas exudes a real intimacy, thanks to the artist integrating the figures with their surroundings." He went on to say the work confirms Metzinger's move away from divisionism, although he still uses cubes to build his picture, and shows a preoccupation with mathematics. The exhibition attracted over 200,000 visitors, and reception was mixed. Guillaume Apollinaire lauded the works as a revolution, while others criticized the pieces, describing them as barbaric distortions. Metzinger figured prominently in the exhibition, with one reviewer describing him as the young prince of Cubism. Art historians now credit the April 1911 event for introducing Cubism to the public in France, and moving Parisian art toward multi-perspective realism. The exhibition generated increasing interest from galleries, and also among other European artists. Following their controversial joint showing, and recognizing their common interests, the members of the group formally named themselves the Golden Section, referring to a mathematical ratio that had been used in art for centuries, for ensuring visually pleasing proportions of subjects on the canvas. In August 1911, Metzinger published an article in Paris Journal defending Cubism against critics, who claimed it was destroying the great French artistic tradition. Metzinger argued that Cubism continued that tradition. "What we call tradition is an uninterrupted series of innovations," he said. "And Cubism is one of those innovations. Thanks to Cubism, a picture that used to represent space now captures time as well." It was one of his clearest public defenses of the movement. Metzinger's painting, Tea Time, was exhibited in the October 1911 Autumn Salon, held at the Grand Palais in Paris. By this time, his faceting had become fully cubist. The seated woman, table, cup, and surrounding space are fractured into crystalline planes, as though seen from multiple viewpoints simultaneously. Tea Time was a prime example of Salon Cubism. The painting was better known than any work that Picasso or Braque had produced by then, because Metzinger's Salon paintings were more visible to the public. By 1911, critics were regarding Picasso and Braque's works as an extreme form of Cubism. The duo had adopted a near-complete fragmentation of form, in which objects and figures became an indecipherable mass of overlapping planes and muted tones. Metzinger's work was seen as a mildly decorative and a more understandable variation of the same trends. The critics dubbed Metzinger's painting, Tea Time, the Mona Lisa of Cubism. The work was exhibited again in Paris, at the Golden Section Salon exhibition in October 1912. It was also reproduced in the book on Cubism, by Jean Metzinger and Albert Gleises in 1912. In the following year, it was reproduced in Guillaume Apollinaire's book, The Cubist Painters. In March 1912, Metzinger exhibited his painting, The Bathers, at the Salon of the Independents. Here he revisits a classical theme, bathers and villages, but its treatment is not at all classical. Instead of individual brushstrokes of pure colors, coming together to form an image, he used individual planes, arcs, spheres, cones and cubes of color. The result is a dynamic composition that appears as if captured from several different viewpoints at the same time. In October 1912, the Golden Section group mounted their own Cubist exhibition, labeled The Golden Section. This was held at the Galerie de la Boétie in Paris. Over 200 paintings and sculptures were shown. Many of the works traced the development of the artists from 1909 to 1912, so it felt like a Cubist retrospective. It was the most important pre-war Cubist exhibition held so far, and exposed a much wider audience to Cubist works. The show was a great success, and helped establish Cubism as the leading avant-garde movement in Paris. Collectors took notice, even if critics and the public didn't fully understand the works. To coincide with the show, Metzinger and Gleises had spent months discussing and drafting their ideas on painting, resulting in the publication of what was to become their hugely influential book, titled On Cubism. It was the first theoretical interpretation, clarification and justification of Cubism, written by artists who actively shaped it. The book immediately became a work of reference on contemporary art for critics, collectors and artists across Europe. The authors presented Cubism as an artistic theory that moved beyond simple imitation and decoration. Cubism was the logical progression of art, having evolved from the superficial realism of earlier artists. Cubism, they said, is meant to satisfy the mind, rather than the eye, leading the viewer towards more imaginative depths. The authors stressed that artists must avoid merely applying laws of color and form. Painting is a manifestation of the artist's will and taste, they said, moving and directing the viewer, rather than simply seeking to replicate nature. There is only one truth: that the artist fashions reality in the image of his own mind. In the book, Metzinger and Gleises went on to discuss their revolutionary concept of mobile perspective. The idea that an artist should paint as though moving around an object, to capture it from multiple viewpoints. In this painting, the human figure is reconstructed using angular facets to the point where the distinction between the body and the surrounding space almost disappears. These ideas helped explain and legitimize the multi-perspective approach that had earlier been pioneered by Picasso and Braque. For Metzinger, Cubism was not purely geometry. He saw it as a way to represent space, other than by using classical perspective. The result being a more direct representation of the world. The book, On Cubism, quickly gained popularity, running through 15 editions in 1912. In the following year it was translated into several European languages, including Russian and English. There were no other official Cubist exhibitions before World War I broke out, an event which ended the group's activities. 2 more Golden Section shows were mounted later, in 1920 and 1925, with support from dealer Léonce Rosenberg, showing how Cubism had evolved. The earliest well-documented occasion on which Metzinger's Cubist paintings were exhibited outside France was at the Exhibition of Cubist Art in Barcelona in April 1912. Several of his works were shown, including Still Life, Fruit Bowl and Jug. Other artists exhibiting were Albert Gleises, Marcel Duchamp, Henri Lefauconnier, and Juan Gris. The exhibition is widely regarded as the first display of Cubist works to be held in Spain. Later, in 1912, a major international Cubism exhibition took place in Moscow at the Golden Fleece Salon. It was organized by Russian artists and patrons who were eager to introduce the newest Parisian modernism to Russian audiences. Metzinger was among the best-known Cubist artists to be represented. His painting, Woman with a Horse, was shown, along with several other compositions he had produced in 1911. In this painting, some elements are clearly taken from the natural world, and others are entirely abstract. Despite the intense fracturing of the surfaces, the woman remains beautiful, elegant and refined. Exhibited again at the Salon of the Independents, as well as the Salon of the Golden Section in October 1912, the painting was highly acclaimed. Guillaume Apollinaire subsequently featured it in his book, The Cubist Painters, Aesthetic Meditations, in 1913. The Danish physicist Niels Bohr, who won a Nobel Prize for his theory of wave-particle duality, purchased Metzinger's Woman with a Horse in 1930, giving it pride of place in his home. Perhaps he recognized Metzinger's interest in multiple overlapping perspectives, a subject Bohr had pursued himself, as a physicist. In October 1912, Metzinger exhibited Dancer in a Café at the Autumn Salon, held at the Grand Palais, which caused a stir. The Municipal Council of Paris debated whether public funds should be used to exhibit barbaric art of this type. The painting depicts a woman dancing in a café concert. Metzinger painted it at the same time he published his book, On Cubism, which characterizes Cubism as the art of the modern age. In 1912, a café concert was typical of modern Parisian life. In this painting, Metzinger shows us the modernity Cubism was built to capture. Reviewing the Autumn Salon exhibition, an art critic noted the seductive charm and sureness of execution of Metzinger's entries. He compared him to Pierre-Auguste Renoir and described him as the man of our time who knows best how to paint. Another critic made less flattering comments, claiming that the work has the effect of a puzzle that is not properly assembled. Following the publication of his book, Metzinger was appointed to the faculty of the Palais Academy, which at the time was under the directorship of fellow artist Henri Le Fauconnier. The following year, Metzinger took on additional teaching positions at the Académie Arrhenius, and also at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière. In 1912, Metzinger painted at the Velodrome, adapting the avant-garde pictorial language of Cubism to a cycle race. The painting depicts the finish of the 1912 Paris-Roubaix race, and its winner, Charles Crupelant. The excitement of the finish line and impression of speed can be seen in the cyclist's pose, and in the inclusion of the spinning back wheel of another racer, just out of view to the left of the canvas. The number 4, seen in the grandstand, is thought to be a reference to Metzinger's theories of the fourth space in art. In 1913, Guillaume Apollinaire wrote his own treatise on Cubism, The Cubist Painters, Aesthetic Reflections. It presented the poet and critic's aesthetic meditations on 9 painters, including Pablo Picasso, Georges Braque, and Jean Metzinger. In the text, Apollinaire described Metzinger as the third Cubist, after Picasso and Braque. He described Metzinger's work as having a sense of purity, of rigorous logic, and of art which extends deeper than conventional vision. Metzinger's Cubism is thoughtful, accessible, and methodically constructed, he said. Where others indulge in the most radical experimentation, he retains a rigor in composition which allows his art to remain readable and intelligible, he said. Metzinger's works have a style which sets them apart from most of the works of his contemporaries. In May 1913, Metzinger's paintings were exhibited in Milwaukee in the opening of the Traveling American Show, exhibition of Cubist and Futurist pictures. Although sometimes confused with the Armory Show, which was held earlier in 1913, this was a separate exhibition, and included paintings by Jean Metzinger, Albert Gleizes, Fernand Léger, Marcel Duchamp and Jacques Villon. The exhibition, which was organized through the Gimbel Brothers department store network, traveled from Milwaukee to Cleveland, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia over the year. Metzinger's portrait of an American smoking was reproduced on the cover of the exhibition catalogue. Though he did not exhibit with his Cubist colleagues at the earlier February Armory Show of 1913, Metzinger's contribution through this traveling exhibition helped to bring the latest in European modern art to the American people. During 1914, Metzinger began moving away from the fragmented abstract style of analytic cubism toward an orderly classical style, now called crystal cubism. Metzinger was among the earliest artists to develop its characteristics. Soldier at a Game of Chess is widely regarded as one of the earliest examples, with its simplified geometry, flattened space, and highly ordered structure. The painting depicts a French soldier calmly smoking a cigarette and playing a game of chess. Germany declared war on France on August 3, 1914. The event shattered the tight-knit Parisian art scene, as artists scattered internationally amidst the chaos. Albert Gleizes initially enlisted in the French army, before moving to New York in 1915. Matisse relocated to the French Riviera, and Le Fauconnier moved to the Netherlands. Metzinger stayed behind, and was called up for military service in March 1915. He was assigned to serve as a medical orderly close to the Western Front, where he spent months witnessing the horrific ravages of trench warfare. The physical and psychological strain of his war service took a heavy toll on Metzinger, and he was invalided out of the military with severe health issues late in 1915. He spent a significant amount of time hospitalized in 1916. On his return to Paris, he found the city entirely changed. The Golden Section group no longer operated, and many of his close friends were away fighting. However, he continued to develop his artistic and theoretical work as best he could throughout the war, and also exhibited, although irregularly. With traditional art exhibitions halted, Metzinger faced severe financial stress. To survive, he signed a 3-year contract in 1916 with the prominent art dealer Léonce Rosenberg. A second contract in 1918 modified the first, making it renewable every 2 years, and Rosenberg increased the prices he paid for Metzinger's work. The added financial security allowed Metzinger more freedom to experiment with his painting. In a letter to Albert Gleizes in July 1916, Metzinger wrote of the perspective he had developed. "I have succeeded in establishing the basics of this kind of perspective," he said. "It is not the materialist perspective of Gris, nor the romantic perspective of Picasso. It is rather a metaphysical perspective. The geometry of the fourth space has no more secrets for me. Previously I had only intuitions, now I have certainty." The fourth space was for Metzinger the space of the mind. His new perspective was a relationship between the ideas in his mind and the exterior world, resulting in a new harmony. By 1916, critics began noticing his new direction. At Metzinger's exhibition at the Bernheim Jeune Gallery, a reviewer described his work as jewelry, suggesting the crystalline precision and refinement that would later give the movement its name. His works began taking on more simplified forms. In Woman in Lace, the figure is emblematic rather than naturalistic, emphasizing the clarity of his work. Metzinger's Crystal period was a return to a simple, robust art, which offered new possibilities. In 1916, his work was shown at the annual exhibition of modern art at the Bourgeois Gallery in New York, one of the largest showcases of modern art in America. The exhibition showed the latest American paintings, alongside European works, including Metzinger, Matisse, Picasso, and Duchamp. In 1917 and 1919 Metzinger exhibited again at this same event. After 1916, Metzinger's work gets colder, more austere, and more disciplined. Lady at Her Mirror shows that shift. He had resisted the temptation to move to total abstraction, and his works remained cubist, but wide-ranging in form, with close parallels to artist and friend, Juan Gris. The clarity and sense of order of the works produced by both artists between 1917 and 1920 would later be referred to as crystal cubism by the art critic Maurice Raynal. In this picture, a bowl of fruit, a glass, and a carafe come together to create a sense of interconnectedness. The multifaceted planes are more angular than Metzinger's previous works, and he makes more use of block colors, rather than shading. The image is flat, and uses thick expressive brushstrokes, while the layered objects carry a sense of glass-like transparency. In 1918, dealer Léonce Rosenberg organized a series of cubist exhibitions at his gallery, to assist artists such as Picasso, Braque and Gris who had been stranded, when their German-born dealer, Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, was forced into exile in Switzerland, leaving them without an income. The exhibitions were a success, even in the depressed after-war art market, and Rosenberg became a dependable buyer of Cubist art. This allowed other Cubist artists, such as Jean Metzinger and Albert Gleizes, to also benefit. By 1920, something subtle began to appear in Metzinger's paintings. His forms became more legible again. In a September 1920 letter to Rosenberg, Metzinger wrote about a return to nature, but not by abandoning Cubism. He was rebuilding representation, using Cubist structure. Rosenberg exhibitions, along with a well-organized Cubist showing at the 1920 Salon of the Independents, and a revival of the Salon of the Golden Section the same year, demonstrated that Cubism was still very much alive. By the 1920s, the explosive collaborative atmosphere of pre-war Paris no longer existed in the same form. Metzinger began moving away from the experimental phase that had characterized his earlier work. His paintings became more ordered. The fractured, shifting surfaces of his earlier Cubist work softened into clearer compositions and smoother modeling. He began using a combination of moody colors and volumetric shading of rounded forms, and was increasingly recognized as a respected elder artist, rather than a radical insurgent. During the previous 10 years, Metzinger had been on the cutting edge of Cubism, almost in real time. He had been writing theory, exhibiting controversial works, and arguing for new ideas about space and perception. By the 1920s, Cubism was no longer new. It had become part of the mainstream. Metzinger's personal life appears to have changed significantly in the 1920s. His wife, Lucy Souberon, largely disappears from the historical record after 1915, with standard biographies providing no detail about how or when Metzinger's relationship with Lucy might have changed. By 1923, Metzinger appears to have accepted that his marriage to Lucy was over. He met Suzanne Faucos, a French painter, born in Lille in 1897 of Greek parents, and began living with her. Faucos was a frequent subject in Metzinger's work. Aside from Suzanne, naked with a goldfish, she modeled for other major pieces, like Suzanne Faucos in a sombrero, and Bust of Suzanne by the Sea in 1935. Faucos in turn created an iconic portrait of Metzinger in 1926, which is typical of her style. The painting is now in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in Paris. Suzanne became his primary muse and intellectual partner. They married in 1929, and remained together from then on. Faucos herself exhibited independently as a figurative post-Cubist painter. She appears in Salon art records at that time as an artist, rather than merely as the wife of Jean Metzinger. Later Salon exhibition histories continued to include her work between 1944 and 1949, but there is no evidence that she also exhibited in galleries during this period. As the 1920s progressed, Metzinger began to include more realistic elements in his work, including depictions of urban life. His bold, rich colors were unashamedly artificial, and although he used realistic representation, it was not shown naturalistically. He continued to exhibit at Rosenberg's gallery throughout the 1920s alongside other artists, and by the second half of the decade, was working with less fragmented forms. Influenced by his friend artist Fernand Léger, Metzinger's work began to take on a more mechanical look. The paintings were still geometrically constructed, but no longer strictly Cubist in theory or intent. Metzinger turned to a more classical and decorative approach to painting, with elements of surrealism. The forms in these works become progressively streamlined, and contain geometrically simplified elements that suggest the Art Deco aesthetic of the early 1920s and 30s. He kept using geometric structure and multiple viewpoints, but art historians don't classify these later works as Cubist. Cubism is historically divided into two phases. The first, analytic Cubism, emphasized the deconstruction and analysis of objects on the canvas, which were rendered in monochromatic colors of grays and earth tones. The second phase, known as synthetic Cubism, emerged around 1912. These compositions were typically larger, incorporating brighter colors, as well as collage materials, ranging from newspaper and sheet music to cigarette and tobacco packaging. Synthetic Cubist paintings emphasized the building up of the objects on the canvas. The labels, Analytic and synthetic cubism were adopted by art historians in the late 1920s, after the Cubist period had ended. None of the Cubist artists used these terms at the time. They simply regarded themselves as developing Cubism. Gallery owner and writer, Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, described Cubism as evolving from a phase of analysis toward one of synthesis, in his 1920 book The Path to Cubism. The book focused on the paintings of Picasso, Braque, Léger, and Gris, but said nothing about the tidy textbook chronology that we use today, with analytic cubism occurring between 1909 and 1912, and synthetic cubism between 1912 and 1914. By the 1930s, these terms appeared regularly in scholarly writing, museum catalogues, and histories of modern art. After World War II, they became the standard framework through which Cubism was discussed. Metzinger's work does not fit neatly into this scheme, although any suggestion that he deserved to be relegated to a secondary role in Cubism, as some critics have suggested, is a mistake. Many modern scholars argue that to do so overlooks his crucial contribution, transforming Cubism from a studio practice into a coherent artistic theory that could be debated, taught, and adopted internationally. Metzinger's paintings, such as Tea Time and Woman with a Horse, painted in 1911, already combined analytical fragmentation with synthetic organization. Later, the analytic-synthetic split became a useful teaching device, rather than a rigid historical reality. By the 1930s, Metzinger was no longer a radical avant-garde figure. Instead, he occupied the role of an established modern master. His paintings became more figurative, more decorative, and more classical. They were less aggressively experimental than his early works. Yet he never completely abandoned Cubist principles. The multiple viewpoints and geometric ordering of form remained present beneath the surface of his paintings. After 1930, he was still concerned with questions of form, volume and relationship of figures, along with the visible geometric properties of space. He continued to exhibit as widely and as frequently as possible. He was popular in London, holding solo showings at both the Leicester Galleries in 1930 and the Hanover Gallery in 1932. In 1939, fearing the approach of the Second World War, Metzinger and his wife moved to Bandol, a highly regarded Mediterranean health resort on the French Riviera. As the threat of war intensified, the coastal town became an increasingly important refuge for artists, intellectuals, and foreigners fleeing before the outbreak of hostilities in France. They lived there until 1943, when the formerly unoccupied Southern Free Zone was occupied. Provence, including Bandol, experienced first Italian and then German control. During 1943 the occupation became increasingly restrictive, with military requisitions, arrests, surveillance, and growing resistance activity. Fearing the worst, Metzinger and his wife returned to occupied Paris. Soon after their return, in May 1943, Metzinger held a solo exhibition at Galerie Hessel in Paris. It was one of the most important events of his late career, as it marked his public return to the Paris art world, after spending much of the war in the south of France. The exhibition, titled Recent and Earlier Works by Jean Metzinger, displayed a mix of neo-impressionist and cubist works, as well as paintings completed during the late 1930s and the war years. The retrospective allowed visitors to view his artistic development over a 30-year period. This solo exhibition has never received the same scholarly attention as his Cubist exhibitions before 1914, but it was a significant event, helping restore his visibility after the relatively quiet years of the war. The content of the exhibition would have surprised viewers who knew only Metzinger's Cubist works. His wartime paintings are much softer and more lyrical. Many are based on classical figure compositions, and they are less geometrically fragmented, yet they still retain unmistakably Cubist construction. Rather than abandoning Cubism, Metzinger had transformed it into what some historians call his humanized cubism. Art historians often describe Metzinger's painting style after 1945 as the culmination of his Cubist works. He no longer sought to revolutionize painting; instead, he demonstrated how Cubist principles could be applied to create harmonious and timeless compositions. His late paintings show remarkable consistency with ideas he had expressed decades earlier, in his book on Cubism. Geometry remained the underlying structure of the image, but it was now used in the service of clarity, rhythm, and beauty, rather than for radical experimentation. His work during this period is best described as late decorative cubism. It is distinct from both the fractured cubism of his youth and the non-representational abstraction that became dominant in the art world after World War II. Metzinger largely ignored these developments. Instead, he continued refining the Cubist language he had helped invent 40 years earlier. In the 1940s and 50s, Metzinger shifted his intellectual focus to teaching and writing. In 1946, he published a short memoir, Dinner with Guillaume Apollinaire. Then in 1947, he participated in the release of a new deluxe, limited edition of On Cubism, a reprint of the pioneering 1912 manifesto, with an introduction by Albert Gleizes and an epilogue by himself. The epilogue provided the closing historical reflection, looking back over 35 years, and commenting on what Cubism had achieved. In the same year, Metzinger published a book of 27 poems in the symbolist idiom, titled Ecluses. The work seems to have been treated more as a late literary curiosity, from an established Cubist artist, than as a widely reviewed poetry event. However, the collection remains a testament to Metzinger's status as a true multidisciplinary master of the French avant-garde. Metzinger carried on teaching, late into his career. In 1950, he was given a teaching post at the Akademie Frauschau, working in the Frauschau Pigalle studio complex, a position he held for 3 years. Jean Metzinger died in November 1956 in Paris, leaving behind a considerable body of work, both pictorial and theoretical. Although his name is sometimes overshadowed by those of Picasso and Braque, his role in the history of Cubism cannot be overstated. Jean Metzinger's works are included in private and public collections across the world, including the Guggenheim Museum in New York, the Tate Gallery in London, and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, among others. Jean Metzinger was an artist who is central to our understanding of Cubism. He not only participated in its growth, but also structured its foundations. His paintings and writings give Cubism coherence and depth, making it much more than just a pictorial style. Metzinger gave it intellectual legitimacy, which continues today.